what in fact is going on in our world. What is the future of French Jewry? And what is our own future in this country? David Harris knows American Jewry, and he knows world Jewry like no one else. And permit me to say that not only is it my opinion, but I believe that he is the closest thing that we have to a spokesman for not only American Jewry, but for world Jewry. And so it is a delight, and I regard us as extremely fortunate to be able to call upon David Harris at this time.
Shabbat Shalom. Before I begin speaking, as they say, allow me to say a few words. I feel very close to this congregation, and I feel blessed that when my wife and our children and I moved from Washington, D.C. here in 1991, that we found Rabbi Greenberg, and we found a spiritual and community home in Shaarei Tefillah. And I think we feel every bit as much that today as we did in 1991 when we came here. So I want to thank you, Rabbi, for providing that home and spiritual and communal haven that we all need. I also want to say a thank you, a shout out to the two of you, Stuart and Kerry, for leading the Israel Task Force here and for revitalizing it and making it the dynamic force that it is, and boy, do we need it. And last but by no means least, my mother is watching us on the live stream, Rabbi. So a shout out to my mother. I suppose secretly she always wanted a television star. This is the best she's going to get. But thanks to the miracle of technology, a 90-year-old woman can sit in her home and watch us this evening. I think that's wonderful. I recall that after 9/11, I attended a couple of funerals, as some of you may have, people that I work with, people I knew. And what struck me in those funerals, and one in particular at Park Avenue Synagogue on East 87th, what struck me was that had someone walked into that sanctuary and not known the circumstances of the death, but simply the fact that a funeral was taking place, they never would have known that the person in the casket had been murdered. What struck me was the absence of anger. People gathered in sorrow as if this person had died a natural death. Well, I have to be honest with you. I come here today not just in sorrow, but in anger. And I want to be very clear about it. Not angry at you, but I come in anger. I come in anger, first of all, because my mother and those of her generation who lived in France heard with their own ears in 1940 when the so-called Maginot Line, which was meant to defend France against any possible aggression from Germany, proved a porous line and didn't for a single moment deter the German forces from entering and occupying France. I'm angry because my mother, as early as 1940, heard the words mort aux juifs, death to the Jews. And in the ensuing 17 months for my mother and her brother and her parents, my grandparents, they sought to stay a step ahead of both the occupying Nazis and the collaborating Vichy, and the words that emerged like Drancy and résidence forcée, which became part of the vocabulary confronting the Jews of France and other Jews who had come to France in sanctuary, hoping for safety. And now my mother, at age 91, has to once again hear the words on French streets, mort aux Juifs, and even worse, has to hear the news reports from France, quatre Juifs sont morts, 4 Jews are dead. What do I tell my mother as she worries about the future even more than my wife and me of her grandchildren and the families that they will build, we hope? What do we tell that generation about how much has been achieved and how much danger remains? I'm angry because too often I've heard that we Jews are the canary in the mine. I don't want to be the canary in the mine. The canary in the mine must die of carbon monoxide or methane poisoning in order for the miner to live. I'm not ready yet to be the Jewish canary that saves the rest of the world while we become the sacrificial bird. But what I think we are is the Cassandra, the Greek mythological character, the daughter of King Priam, who spurned the romantic advances of Apollo, if I recall, or Jupiter, I'm not sure which. And the punishment that Cassandra paid for spurning the romantic advances, as many of you know, was she would be destined to tell the truth, but no one would believe her. I believe that we have become the Cassandra of the world. We are telling the truth, and too few are willing to listen. Oh, there go the Jews again with their Schreingewalt, with their worrying and fetching. It's probably some sneaky ruse to protect Israel or to get some special attention for the Jews. You know, those Jews always want something special. Well, I can tell you from very personal experience, I can't for a moment predict the stock market. In fact, it's well known at AJC that if David Harris ever said, buy a stock, rush to your broker and sell. If David Harris says we need to buy more euros today, be sure you need to sell your euros and buy dollars. But one thing we could tell, and that was where Europe was headed. And I could write a book, and maybe one day, time permitting, I will, about the literally hundreds, if not thousands, of meetings in which I and my AJC colleagues participated over the last 15 years in every European capital, including centrally France. And the meetings we had with presidents and with prime ministers and ministers of the interior and ministers of justice and foreign ministers and education ministers and other leaders, asking them to wake up, asking them to understand that there were challenges aplenty and they were not going to solve themselves. My wife and I and our family spent a sabbatical year in Geneva, Switzerland in 2000 and 2001. And as some of you know, Geneva is on the French border. We spent a lot of time with the French Jewish community, following the news as we saw the outbreak of anti-Semitism connected with the so-called Second Intifada. And we went and we met with French leaders at the time, and we said, wake up to the threat. And they said, no, 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 you don't understand. And by the way, the they included Jacques Chirac, with whom we had a rather heated debate in his office, in the Élysée Palace. Mr. President, the Jews feel that France has abandoned them. Protect them. Stand up for them. No, 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 monsieur, vous ne comprenez pas. You don't understand. It is not anti-Semitism, it is hooliganism that they face. It is criminality that they face. It is insecurity that they face. No, 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 Monsieur le Président. When Jews, qua Jews, are pursued, there's a specificity that has a name. And this continent and this country knows that name better than any. But you see, Monsieur Harris, maybe it is the importation of the Middle East conflict to France. And c'est dommage, it's a shame, but it is perhaps inevitable. Monsieur le Président, with great respect, even if it is the importation of the conflict, which we do not believe it is, it cannot for a single moment justify the targeting and the pursuit of Jews in France for the alleged misdeeds of countries thousands of miles away. And again, we don't even accept the premise. The conclusion of the discussion, inevitably, whether it was Jacques Chirac or Hubert Védrine, the foreign minister, or others, with great respect to our American friends, we know our country better than you do. And so it went again and again and again, in Brussels and in Paris, and in Dublin and in London, and in Lisbon and in Madrid, and in Stockholm and Stockholm and Stockholm, and in Oslo and Copenhagen and elsewhere. And we couldn't wake them up. And then came 2005. And in 2005, the Danish newspaper published the now legendary cartoons. And there was exactly one group that traveled to Copenhagen, Denmark, immediately after the publication of those cartoons, because that group witnessed the burning of the Danish flag around the world, around the Muslim world, the assaults on Danish embassies in much of the Muslim world, and that group was AJC. We were the only non-governmental group in the world to travel to Denmark to stand in solidarity with Denmark and its people. And I don't say that proudly. Yes, I'm happy that we went, but it's a scandal that no one else went as well. And even fellow EU countries tried to distance themselves from Denmark. Let me be clear. Had we been the editors of that Danish newspaper, I don't for a single moment believe we would have published those cartoons. Not because we didn't have the right to publish the cartoons. Of course we did, they do. We didn't find them in good taste, and we would not gratuitously denigrate another religious faith. But when the reaction came, and when we saw the protests, and yes, the murders, and the burnings of flags, we felt there was a higher value at stake even than those cartoons. And who the hell were these protesting mobs in the Muslim world to complain about blasphemy and denigration when every one of their media outlets in Egypt and in Lebanon and in Saudi Arabia and in Iran and Pakistan and all the rest, have no hesitation, none whatsoever, to publish raw, unadulterated anti-Semitism in their outlets. And by the way, a not unimportant point, anti-Christianity as well. The denigration of the so-called infidel. So where was the world in Denmark? Why were they all pretending they didn't know where Denmark was? Why was it left to one non-governmental group, to AJC, to travel there and to be alone and standing up for what happened? Now, all of a sudden, after Charlie Hebdo, everyone is a hero. You can't find any more copies of the latest edition of Charlie Hebdo. And bless the people for buying them, and bless the people for going out into the streets of France. But we lost almost 10 years in this battle, because once again, as in 2000 and 2001, too many Europeans and others averted their eyes, hoping that if they weren't associated, they wouldn't be touched. But they would be touched. Britain would be touched. Spain would be touched. We would be touched. Australia, Canada, Indonesia, India, we'd all be touched. Because what the world is now slowly waking up to, in some cases almost reluctantly, is we face a global threat. And France in particular, we said from the beginning, is going to be the laboratory for the encounter between Islam and modernity. France, as you know, has the largest Jewish population in all of Europe, as many as 600 to 650,000 Jews. And it has the largest Muslim population in Europe, a ratio of approximately 10 to 1 to the Jews. Now, there are those Americans who say in typical fashion, to hell with France. They said it at the time of 2002 and 3 when we suddenly renamed French fries and did other silly things. But I want to share with you what we said then and what we continue to believe. France cannot afford to lose France. We cannot afford to lose France. The world cannot afford to lose Europe. This is not a silly children's game. France is the home of Voltaire. France is the home of the values that informed the Western Enlightenment. France was the home of Léon Blum and Pierre Mendès France, two Jewish prime ministers, long before this country even conceived of having one day potentially a Jewish president. France is a member of the Security Council. France has a veto in the Security Council. France has la force frappe, a nuclear force. France, together with Germany, is the driver of the 28 nations of Europe. We cannot afford to see France lose this battle. The French battle is the American battle. The French battle is the Jewish battle. The French battle is the Western democratic pluralistic battle. And the French battle, yes, in its own way, is Israel's battle too. So it's late in the day, and we already witnessed the brutal, savage murder of Ilan Halimi, a name that if you don't immediately recognize, I urge you to scribble and to look it up in Google later on this evening, or maybe not this evening, you won't sleep. Tomorrow morning would be better. Understand what happened to Ilan Halimi, a young Jew in the center of Paris after he was kidnapped and brutally tortured for 3 weeks and murdered as a Jew. Or how about March of 2012, the Ozar HaTorah school in Toulouse, France. 3 Jewish children killed as Jewish children, and one father in front of the school by Mohammed Merah. And what about in May of last year in Brussels? The Jewish Museum. 4 people whose only crime was to visit a Jewish museum in the heart of Brussels were murdered. And the suspect? Mehdi Nemmouche. And what was so interesting about Mehdi Nemmouche? The 3 characteristics that we at AJC had been talking about with the ministers of Interior and the ministers of Justice and the prime ministers of Europe again and again of late. Mehdi Nemmouche crossed the border from France to Belgium in order to kill. But those of you who visit Europe know there are no borders. So there is no such thing anymore as a uniquely French problem. Mehdi Nemmouche lived closer to Jewish targets in Brussels than to other Jewish targets in France, so he was able to cross the border. There is no border. There are no controls. So a French problem is a Schengen group problem, or a European problem, if you will. Mehdi Nemmouche had spent time in French prisons for criminal acts. In the French prisons, he had been radicalized to become a jihadist. And Mehdi Nemmouche went to Syria. He went to Syria. How many Europeans today are in Syria and Iraq, and now we know from 2 weeks ago, Yemen and Lebanon, getting training, battlefield experience, and if they survive believing that they have been given a gift by Allah to return, but not to become elementary school teachers or social workers. And if there are several thousand such people from Europe, and by the way, the United States, and by the way, we met with the Chinese ambassador to the UN earlier this week from China, the western part, and from Indonesia and from Australia, what happens when they return to their respective countries? Who's going to watch them? Who's going to monitor them? And it takes 24/7 surveillance, day after day, year after year, in order to achieve some measure of protection. So Mehdi Nemmouche was, for us, the poster child of the wake-up call. But still, that wasn't enough, and so we had the events of 2 weeks ago or less in France. And what we saw was what we had also been trying to say again and again, and yes, a reason why I'm also angry. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem alone. It's not a proprietary issue. It's not by Jews and about Jews. It's by non-Jews who target Jews, but who are really targeting the values of democratic and pluralistic societies. And anti-Semitism history should have taught us may begin with Jews. It never ends with Jews. Anti-Semitism is like a cancer that, uncured, will metastasize and ultimately destroy the body politic of the nation. And it was fully on display in Paris. Who were the targets? And they were entirely consistent and compatible to the terrorists. A newspaper that may have done silly things to some, but at the end of the day was exercising Voltaire's right of free speech. That's all. And by the way, Charlie Hebdo, if you've read it, has done some pretty egregious things about Christians, Catholics in particular, including popes. And Jews have also been an equal opportunity target. So this is not an Islamophobic magazine by any stretch of the imagination. It's a magazine that wants to push the limit of free speech and challenge conventional thinking. And it has the right. But it was perfectly logical for the buddy of the brothers to target a kosher supermarket because the two went hand in hand: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of worship for minority groups, the Jews. And of course, to kill a policewoman on the street, a total of 17 innocent victims. And again, it illustrated what we've tried to say. Anti-Semitism is a harbinger of dark days for all of Europe and not just for the Jews. And by the way, if the Jews, we said, leave Europe, and some are and others are considering it, they have places to go. But where will Europe go? Will Europe finally find the courage and the spine and the resoluteness to stand up proudly and defend its laudable values? There is nothing to be apologetic for in Europe, no more than here. We're not perfect, but we get it right more than we get it wrong. It's the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Libyans and the Pakistanis who are coming to us to live, not us to them to live. Because there's something flawed and failed in their countries, in their societies. We have something to be proud about. And you don't have to be an ultra-nationalist, God forbid, an extreme right-winger, heaven forbid, in Europe to stand up and defend core democratic and pluralistic values. And it's time Europe did. And it's time Europe spent less time focusing on adding more vacation days and more benefits and more me-ism, and start thinking a bit more about we-ism. What do we stand for? And the Jews are caught now in a pincer movement. They're caught between three forces: radical Muslims. Oh, and by the way, our enemy does have a name. Let's be clear. Our adversary does have a name. The notion that we can somehow pretend it doesn't have a name, or heaven forbid we should assign it a name, is to me ultimately foolishness. David Cameron has recognized that we have a name for the enemy. François Hollande has recognized now that we have a name. It's time that all of us recognize that there is a name for our enemy. For those who would behead and crucify and enslave and exile and kidnap, there is a name. But that's not the only danger for Jews in Europe, because that is triggering a response from the extreme right, which has been given a new lease on life by the economic travails of Europe, plus concerns about migration and lack of integration. So now you have phenomena like the Golden Dawn Party in Greece, which openly displays neo-Nazi symbols as part of its paraphernalia, or the Jobbik Party in Hungary, or the extreme right-wing party in France, which today may be the single most popular party in the country, and on it goes. And then you have a third force in Europe that's also trapping Jews, the force that rejects both, but ultimately says, we accept Jews, we do not accept Israel. Hence, those who stand up and support Israel are also our enemies. The intellectual elites of some countries, the Irish libraries that ban books by Israeli authors, those politicians that speak of Israel the way they would never dare speak even of North Korea or Iran. And the Jews of Europe increasingly are feeling trapped between radical Islam, a growing extreme right, and an intelligentsia that says no to Israel and yes to BDS. So what's going on in Europe is of enormous consequence, not just to Europe and not just to America, but to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. When I spoke on Yom Kippur, and by the way, when the rabbi invites me to speak, you already know it's a bad sign. because he's not inviting me to speak about Jewish recipes or to tell jokes. I said in September at Caramore that this is a defining moment not just for the world but for us. I used the term defining moment. I meant it then, and I repeat it now. I said that if we were a Christian evangelical movement and we were in a big tent in Caramore, I would invite people to stand up and say, Hineni, here I am. Hinenu, here we are. We are proud Jews who believe that Jews anywhere in the world have the right to go to a kosher supermarket on the eve of Shabbat in order to buy challah or schnapps or whatever they wish without fear of death. We are proud Jews who believe that 5 and 6 and 7-year-old children should not have to walk through a gauntlet of armed French soldiers carrying submachine guns surrounded by armored personnel carriers simply to exercise the right to go to first grade, though I thank the French government for providing the security today. But what kind of damage will be inflicted over the long haul on these children who will turn to their parents one day and say, why are they here? Are we bad? What have we done? We need to stand tall and proud so that the Jews in that synagogue in Paris this summer, and I spoke about it on Yom Kippur, I don't even remember which denomination because it doesn't matter to our adversaries. That synagogue was surrounded and the worshipers inside were saved literally and figuratively by a prayer. They have the right to worship, they have the right to go to school, they have the right to eat kosher, they have the right to wear a kippah if they wish, without the chief rabbi of France or any country saying, wear a baseball cap, or don't wear a kippah at all, it's too dangerous. This is a Hineni moment for each of us. Years ago, for many of us, it began in the Soviet Union. But that was there, behind the Iron Curtain. Times were different. It began for many of us in Ethiopia, but there too it was far away. There was a communist regime in Ethiopia. It began in the Arab world where my wife and hundreds of thousands of other Jews lived for centuries, if not millennia. And those communities have disappeared. And now it's France. And now it's Belgium. And now David Cameron was compelled to say, we will not tolerate any more anti-Semitism in Great Britain. So it's not about speeches from the Bima. It's about action the day after the speeches from the Bima. We're at what the famous Yogi Berra said, when you get to the fork in the road, take it. Well, we're at the fork in the road, dear fellow congregants of Sharei Tefillah. We're at the fork in the road. We've been told, we've been warned, we've been alerted, we've been advised. We know what's happening. We see the isolation of Israel by many. We see the demonization of Israel too often. We see French Jews wondering if they have a future in France or need to make aliyah or try to come to America or Canada. And the question is, do we simply listen to speeches or do we go out the day after and act? And my plea to all of us on this Shabbat, a Shabbat that I can only pray will be a Shabbat with shalom, is that all of us will determine tomorrow morning, after the speeches, after the service, when it becomes our choice and our choice alone, that each of us in our own way will say, Hineni, here I am. We'll decide I must do something more. I must get more involved in the Israel Task Force. I must call AJC and find out how I can be of help. I must reach out to Jews in other countries and say, I'm here for you. I'm a lifeline. Let's keep talking. But if each of us leaves this sanctuary and it's business as usual tomorrow and Sunday and Monday, then I believe that Rabbi Greenberg and Rabbi Navarez and I will have failed. Please don't fail us. Shabbat Shalom.